everything all the better. My name is Leo WT, and this is Conversations. We come together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. And the big thing that I don't want you to miss and that I don't want you to overlook is that absolutely everybody's voice is welcome at the conversation. Now, I know that that sounds a little interesting because we've got two assumed to be white males who may or may not be straight, but I want you to know that for conversations, every attempt is made to be intersectional. And I feel like just putting that out there because I know that a lot of times I will have other white folks on, but I don't want someone who's first experience with conversation to see this and think that it's just more white people putting out stuff into an echo chamber. Please definitely make sure you check this out. But that being said, I'm really, really, really excited to have my guest with me today. We are going to be talking about something that's very, very near and dear to my own heart, something that I've experienced in my story, as well as something that I've been experiencing lately in my, in my lived experience and context. So we're going to be talking about gaslighting, and in particular, spiritual gaslighting, and in particular, gaslighting that can come from religious leaders. So Brad and I are going to wander our way around that. But before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to you, my friend, and let you introduce yourself.
My name is Brad. I am a life coach. I specialize in religious trauma and helping people deconstruct, whether it's beginning, middle, or end of the process, and help them find meaning after religious trauma, and gaining their voice and encouraging them to really embrace themselves instead of always adhering to the rules that were placed upon them.
Yes, I love that. And I really didn't know a ton of your story before I got your bio, right? For Brad and I, full disclosure, are working together on an upcoming conference about deconstructing during the holiday seasons, which we'll share the info at the end of this. And we'll also put it in the show notes and in the YouTube notes and in the captions on Facebook. So that'll all be out there. But I got Brad's bio a little bit, and I was really, really interested because you mentioned, Brad, that you have a long history with faith, and I do as well. And we both actually, from the appearances of it, were involved with religion, particularly Christianity, from the inside perspective of people who were pastors. So I've worked in that role, and it seems like you've worked in that role quite extensively. And I think a lot of times people just assume that if you're deconstructing, you're just pissed off and biased. And I think it's really important that people know that for me, I'm coming from a place of deep investment in this system. And it seems like it'd be the same for you.
Oh, definitely. I did go through an anger stage. I mean, quite frankly, I think everybody that kind of deconstructs usually does. But there is peace at the end of it.
Yeah.
You can find peace, and not that we ever stop growing spiritually or growing into who we are, but you do get more confident with yourself, and eventually say, okay, well, the people that are living that life have been taught in, pardon me, but really pushed into their lifestyle since they were a kid.
Absolutely.
That's what the church does, is they raise them up since kids. And so I had to come to a point where I wasn't angry at the people, more angry at the system, if you will.
Yes. So one of the things that I always say, and for those of you who are watching, Brad and I have literally rehearsed none of this, and we're just vibing right now. So welcome to the adventure that we are on. We're all on this together. We're all in this together, across 3 social media channels. But I just think it's so important that people realize that, like, you can have these questions, right? But at the base of it, healthy people attack problems and unhealthy people attack people. And so for me, when I was still struggling the most, right, I was angry at people. And I'm not here to tone police anybody, right? I'm not going to tell anybody your feelings aren't valid, because you get to be angry, and sometimes we're angry at people. But as I grew, I started to see that it wasn't just one person, it was a whole system. And I think that system leads to a lot of the religious trauma and spiritual gaslighting that I've seen. Would that be a fair assessment in your experience?
Definitely. The system breeds it.
Yeah.
There are no safeguards against it.
Yep, absolutely. And I think for those of you who might not be from the Christian world, specifically like evangelical Christendom, this might be a weird name for you, but there's a guy named Mark Driscoll. He used to be a pastor of an evangelical mega church, like mega church. We're talking tens of thousands of people. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the name. Mars Hill, right? Mars
Yep.
Hill. It started in Seattle, and when I was in college to be a pastor, that was we were looking at that movement and how that started. But what happened is Mark Driscoll was essentially, he's kind of a douche canoe. I don't know how else to say this, but he's an overly self-aggrandized white guy that had all of these ideas that flew in the face of convention, and everybody's like, yeah, fly in the face of convention. And he was like, he wasn't a pastor by trade. He just was like, I'm going to start a church. And I think that that's really interesting because we've seen those sort of echoes in maybe politics in our times, where people are like, I'm not a politician. And then they come in and they're like a bull in a china shop. And I'm like, maybe you should have been a politician before you started this. I don't know.
I don't know. I had to go ahead and write down douche canoe.
Yes.
I don't think I've heard that before. I'm going to steal that one from you. Just
I
so you
can't
know.
wait to see your like super important notes at the end of this. Like first bullet point, douche canoe.
All right. I just got a message that we're echoing really bad right now.
On Instagram?
So, I think so, yes.
All right, perhaps we will. I'm gonna ditch the Instagram. Then I think it was a shot in the dark, but maybe we'll put it up there later. Not as a
That
live.
sounds good.
All right.
That's good. Yep. All right.
All right. Sorry about that, friends. We gave it our all, but
We did. We tried it, right?
we tried it. Well, we're live on 2 sites now, so it is what it is. But so Mark Driscoll basically ran his church Mars Hill into the ground, and literally there's an analogy where he talks about leaving a pile of bodies the size of a mountain behind the bus, and you either get on the bus or you get run over the bus and you become part of this pile of bodies. I listened to this podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, where they talked about how the system is set up to encourage leaders like Mark Driscoll. And for those of you who are still with this analogy, I know I'm going to let Brad talk in just a second, but I wanted to set up the stage for you because I think a lot of what we see, and we're seeing this a lot in my hometown right now, is we see this sort of charismatic alpha male person who they have what I like to call, this might be one you want to get your pen out for, but the Church of the Sexy Coffee Bar, where it's like a rock concert every Sunday, and they've got like a freaking barista and saltwater aquarium in the auditorium, and you have the Church of the Sexy Coffee Bar, and really it looks progressive on its face, but when you dig down, you find the same old homophobia, you find the same old white supremacy, and you find the same old narcissistic, charismatic leader who is a god in their own realm. And in a lot of these churches, there's no oversight for that. And so I'm sure it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the amounts of religious trauma and gaslighting that can come from that environment. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I think that's a very fair assessment, because the reality is, even if they do have some sort of oversight, like a deacon board or an elder board, largely it's usually white males. And if the pastor is bringing in lots of people, I mean, he has a lot more power.
Yes.
And so they don't want to get rid of that because they don't want to lose the amount of people that are coming in, which creates money flow and everything else.
Exactly. And I think in this way, we can see a system that is literally set up to provide no checks and balances, and to provide just total, what I would say borders on like idolatry worship of a person. And this sort of ideology, right? As opposed to any sort of real religious endeavor. But it claims to be super spiritual, and I think that's where the gaslighting comes in. Talk to me about, have you ever had any experiences personally with this? I'm sure you have. Or anybody that you've worked with, about moments where you've seen sort of gaslighting come into play in these situations. And even if you feel like describing the idea of gaslighting too, we'll turn it over to you since you're our expert here.
Oh, God. Expert when something I don't want to be an expert. Right? Yeah, I think everybody needs to understand that gaslighting is a way in which someone of power psychologically manipulates someone else.
Mm-hmm.
The type of psychological manipulation. It can make you question your memory, your perception, your sanity
Mm-hmm.
at times. You know, it can take something as simple as what we're doing with here in America with refugees,
Mm-hmm.
and pose a question: would Jesus really help the refugees? You know, exactly. What would Jesus really prefer, peace, or is war like the option? Because in the Bible, there's lots of war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so gaslighting has happened to me, especially in the last church I was in, by my executive pastor.
Mm.
And it's a form of, hey, I'm going to manipulate you either through silence. It
Mm-hmm.
can be silence. It can be through critiques like, hey, you told me to do this, and did I really tell you to do that, or did you just think you heard me say that?
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, there's a way in which they shame you or make you doubt your own memory, when it comes down to it.
Yes. And I feel like that's a lot of what I see in terms of gaslighting, at least the things that I've experienced recently. You'll see like let's say you have pastors who are basically politicians cosplaying as pastors, right? We're having all sorts of discussions in the church that are not theologically based, they're politically based, and they're political opinions, right? And so we have this sort of thing happening, and you have these pastors behaving poorly or making these sort of claims that are blatantly divisive and harmful. But then they
Right.
spin it around and say, no, you were the ones protesting, or you were the ones being angry, or you talking about racism causes division. And then you have, I think, what is kind of one of the most abusive forms of gaslighting, which is gaslighting that pits God against people.
Yes. Yeah. And I got to tell you, pastors are incredibly gifted at this,
Mm-hmm.
because they're already seen as the ones that understand and know the Word of God better than anybody else.
Right. Right.
They're already seen as the person that's inspired by God,
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so they can take scripture, anything from love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbors yourselves, and literally take those two greatest commands that Jesus said and discount them by quoting other passages of scripture to make a different point of why that's not valid in this situation, or how that's benefiting the neighbor if you go to war, let's say, or if you view homosexuality as a sin,
Yep.
or hey, you don't have to love them like that, or the terrible phrase, love the sinner. I mean, love the saint, hate this, or love the person and hate the sin.
Yeah.
It, it's this gaslighting that takes place that basically looks at somebody that is struggling with racism in the church and saying, really, I don't, it's not really there.
Mm-hmm.
And they make them question that, hey, their perception is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible is for, in another way, the Bible is for racism.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that in our past history.
Yes, we have.
You can take the Bible and prove anything in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like, even if you're totally misinterpreting
Exactly.
what it, right?
It's true. And it's so interesting when we hear like a scripture, right? Like, and we're, on Conversations, we talk decidedly from an interfaith perspective. This week we happen to be referring to Christianity because I see this as a large issue within American Christendom, right? So that's my other caveat. I have people that are not white, and we talk about things other than Christianity. But this week, if you're a white Christian, perk up. Or if you too have been harmed by a white evangelical, like I feel like we should have a number at the bottom of the
There are
screen.
too many.
But I think that this is really wild to me, that like the greatest command is love God and love your neighbor. And we've somehow found a way to pull out 7 to 9 verses about LGBTQ people. We've found a way to close our borders that are man-made. Because last I checked, in the creation narratives, in the creation myths, because they were not literal, in the creation myths there were no borders created. I don't remember that. You know what I mean? And I think it's 100% theological gaslighting when we can pit some verses against this idea of love God and love your neighbors and try to skew that. Like, no, a local preacher recently said that love feels a lot like hate when you don't want to receive it. And I think that is the most abusive rhetoric I might have ever heard from a pulpit. Like, how does that come across to you? How would you even approach that if someone said they heard that?
I'd walk out. Yeah, if I was in the front row, I'd stand up and go, out.
But
See ya.
bye.
You're
Be
full of
rad
shit.
out.
Yeah. I mean, but that is the rhetoric from the pulpit in a lot of ways. And the problem is that they're so ingrained within it in a lot of religions that they don't see it that way. And that they're just too blinded to see that. And I blame that on how they're raised. Like, there's a rewiring of the brain when you're a child.
Yes.
And you don't get to critically think this is what is.
Yeah.
And so that's my struggle, because people like that are homophobic or people that are racist or whatever they've learned that I believe a large part from the church.
Yep. I agree.
Or
Yep. I agree. And then you're really encountering, so this is where the system conversation comes into me, because this person, right, this whoever we're all thinking about in our minds, because I'm sure someone, like, you're probably thinking of your former executive pastor, I'm thinking of someone, people who are listening are thinking to someone, right? But this person is not so important that they are the beginning, middle, or end of this conversation. But that in some ways is so terrifying to me, because this gaslighting is happening. This gaslighting is pastors saying, nope, you can't believe that. Nope, that injustice didn't happen. Nope, your existence is not valid because it goes against the word of God. Doesn't matter that your existence and you're feeling more fullness and freedom than you've ever felt. And that system is perpetuating gaslighting. And I just don't know. I mean, this is a conversation that has to be had. How do you encounter, or how do you counsel somebody who is sat at the feet of this person who has just gaslit so many minorities and others? Like, how do we even begin to unwire that on a personal level? Because on a systemic level, that's a conversation for another day. But I'd really like to talk about, how you have recovered from or are recovering from spiritual gaslighting, and how you would kind of counsel and talk to the people that you work with through coaching.
Well, that's a great question. I think a lot of them don't even realize that they have had that experience. Like, they've never heard that term or don't know how to recognize it.
Yeah.
They just think something's wrong with themselves. It's like when they, and the problem with people leaving the church is they miss that community.
Right.
And I'll get back to this gaslighting, because I think it all ties together.
Yeah.
Because, the church comes and says, hey, listen, all are welcome.
Yep.
But it's a bait and switch. We know that, because if all are welcome, that's great. But then you get in the church and like, yeah, but you need to change.
Yep. Exactly.
Because you're this, and this.
Yep.
Right. And they're so hungry for love or acceptance that they're like, okay, well, maybe I am wrong.
Yeah.
Or maybe this is a bad lifestyle.
Yep.
And they cave to that because they are so indoctrinated from that point on. And people are so nice about it in the church a lot of times. Yeah. Like, churches are great for saying, okay, who has the gift of welcoming or hosting, and let's make sure we get them out front there so that people feel really genuinely loved.
Yep.
But love is skewed, right? So when people come to me, they automatically have this, number one, loss of community, and number two, they have this struggle of, well, that's right and this is wrong, and they don't know how they got there.
Yep. And
so it's a web of entangling. Hey, first of all, you have to do it the so-called right and wrong. That alone is a Christian worldview, as they'll call it.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that leads and helps emphasize the gaslighting process. And like, well, this person who's really intellectual, supposedly,
right,
who's standing up on stage said this.
Right.
And so that's got to be right, because, all these other people believe it.
Yep.
Right. And so they doubt themselves.
Yes.
And so a lot of it is helping them find out who they are again. A lot of it is rewiring their brain to look at life like they did before, if you will. You know, if they got into it as a young adult or something. A lot of it is just showing, see how this has taken place, see what they did to you to where you are now. Can you see the cookie crumbs?
Yeah.
And so it is a tedious process, but the beautiful thing about part of it is when I'm talking to people about gaslighting and where it began for them, that when they start, they always have that aha moment.
Yep.
To where they go, oh, they did use that phrase, like, if you report this, you'll destroy your family and friends, and you don't want to do that, do you?
Right. Exactly.
Right? Like, you want to report some sort of abuse.
Yep.
Or something like that. And they realize, oh, wow, that is gaslighting.
Yes.
Oh, it wasn't going to destroy my family or friends.
Right.
They're just trying to protect themselves.
Yep.
You know, and so it's really just getting down. If every individual situation is unique, so you have to kind of get their background and then start back there and slowly start to run and then build their self-esteem and the fact that they do have valid thoughts and emotions and feelings back up because they had basically given those away.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge thing that that abusive theology does, right? And I'm taking strong stances and I'm using strong words because I only recently sort of discovered this idea of religious trauma, I would say within the past 2 years, and started working on it myself. And I realized that I had been a victim of abuse in a lot of ways by a lot of people that I didn't know, right? But I think that there are people out there standing in pulpits and behind mics at school board meetings and on social media platforms and saying, I'm just so glad the truth has come to light. This is the truth. This is what God says. This is what the Bible says. And they just keep saying it over and over again as if the amount of times they say it has bearing. And then also what is, I think, really, really damaging is kind of what you talked about, how someone can have a complete experience and then you're taught to doubt that because the pastor said it happened differently or the church said it happened differently. And I think that that's horribly unfair, but it's also theologically backed up. Because you're not supposed to trust yourself. You're evil. And that's something that's not innate to Christianity. That was a choice that someone made to kind of put that clause in there, right?
It's totally the idea of, hey, ever since you're a kid, you're taught what are you taught? You're taught you're sinful. This guy died for you because you're sinful. There's nothing good that you can ever do.
Yep.
The only good that lives in you or works through you is Jesus. So all credit goes to him. And you should have no confidence in yourself.
No confidence. None. And anyone who has confidence to speak up against the leader of the church is immediately branded a heretic. Immediately. And you know what? Like, heretic is actually not what it's been made out to be. But in the moment that you question a totalitarian, patriarchal, overarching, infallible leader, right? You have become the heretic and suddenly no one can listen to you because you are just, how dare you read the word of God and get something different out of it? Or how dare you have an experience, say you're not even a Christian and you just call out a church that has a harmful practice, well, you're just an evil sinner. And they just write you off. And that is gaslighting.
Very much so. And another avenue they use, which may sound familiar, is they use the idea that you're a gossip.
Yeah. Yep.
I had that used on me at the last place because one of our admins had been, how do I put it? Somebody had compared her breast to a ball.
Okay.
Big ball, right? And so it was actually inappropriate. And they were on staff. Both of them were on staff. And so all of the male elders totally sided with this other guy, right? Of course.
Right? Bro code.
Instead of what it's called out to be was, oh, by the way, you guys are gossiping. And so each one of us got called into an elder meeting and kind of shut down. They were witch hunting, trying to blame it on her. And so it was like, okay, I'm out.
Yeah.
You guys suck.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of guys trying to make it so that it's your fault
Yep.
that you're even talking about this.
Yep. That's textbook, and it takes the responsibility of a flawed system and it puts it on an individual. Like, it makes the system and the people at the top have this air of infallibility so they can say whatever they want. And that really, I mean, this is definitely a rabbit trail, but that's what sets a religion apart from a cult.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's a great point.
I mean,
It's all about protecting
mhm.
the church or the structure, the system.
Yep.
It's all about making sure that it keeps running.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you've encountered this, like, sort of thought in your research in your life that led you to where you work now. But abuse is so much about power and control.
Mm-hmm.
Having power and using control to maintain that power. And I think a lot of times what you see is kind of on the margins of when you call out people that are gaslighting, that's when you see them get rageful and hateful and stuff. Have you ever experienced that? Like, just out of curiosity, because I've definitely done that. Like, I have definitely called out harmful theology and organizations that perpetuate harmful theology. And the second that that happens, it's like rage and veins popping and screaming and personal attacks instead of discussing the conversation.
Yeah, it's like a dog with a bone.
Hmm.
It's they get so angry and territorial,
Hmm.
and they'll use the Bible to back up why they're territorial.
Hmm.
And they will, man, I tell you, it's like the amount of like abuse within the church is a hot topic, right?
Yes.
So when someone goes to report it, you'll hear things like, well, God says to love your enemies and forgive others.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like totally invalidating someone's thought or feelings or experience.
Yep.
And they don't say that out of love,
No. Oh no.
at
Uh-uh.
all. At all. That's a lot of times out of anger or manipulation or, hey, I will destroy you.
Hmm. Literally. And that's the attitude, is that I will destroy you. And I think when you start to hold religious leaders and religious systems accountable and you look at it through the lens of psychology, you can see a lot of, like, for better for worse, a trail of bodies behind the bus, to quote Mark Driscoll. But I want to make a note too, because someone mentioned in the conversations, this is absolutely part systemic and part individual. So we're tackling the individual aspects tonight. I will be planning a conversation to talk about sort of the structures that allow this and underpin it, which of course are white supremacy and toxic masculinity, and patriarchal supremacy, right? These are all things that underpin this. American exceptionalism, Christian nationalism. We'll have a structural and systemic conversation coming up. I want to acknowledge that is a huge part of this, but we're just talking about more from a personal aspect tonight. So that now that that's out in the ether, I did want to acknowledge that comment though. So, but these sorts of things, like these sorts of outbursts, I think one of the ways that you can kind of almost identify an abuser is to disagree with them calmly and see how they react. And for me, that's been a big litmus test of people in my life. Like, are questions safe? Because in a healthy environment with healthy people, questions are safe and I would argue beneficial. But in an unhealthy environment with unhealthy people, questions are a threat and they're met with aggression.
I totally agree. You are exactly right, because when you're calm and you say something that's a critique back,
Uh-huh.
if they turn around and start pointing things out about you,
Yep.
the conversation's over.
Yep.
That's the time you just kind of walk away, because you're not going to get anywhere. The other part you have to watch out for is they say, okay, well, tell me more about this.
Yep.
And they go, okay, well, where's your proof?
Yep. Yep.
Right? I mean, let me see the proof. And it's no doubt that they can argue from a different side the whole time, no matter what proof you have,
Absolutely.
to try to disprove you.
Absolutely.
Where really do you have two calm heads that are talking, going, yeah, I see that. What are we going to do about it?
Exactly. And I think that's really important for people who have been victims of gaslighting, and in particular religious gaslighting, because it's an easy way for you to break out of the matrix, right? When you see this sort of behavior, if you know that that's what this is, you can see it quicker. I know for me, as I've gotten healthier, I've been in counseling for like 10 years and I still go bi-weekly because by virtue of who I am as a person, I will always be dealing with big issues in a public fashion, and I must be a healthy, well-balanced person to deal with them. But the more that I recognize these behaviors, the quicker I can break out of that matrix and stop shaming myself, right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's great that you do that. I also am in therapy bi-weekly.
Yeah.
I guess you could call it checkups.
Yeah.
You could call it whatever you have.
Yep.
It's important.
Yes.
Because it's easy to become overwhelmed or relapse back into the thought process because it's been so long.
Yeah, that relapsing is exactly the case. And for those of us who did grow up in the church, just across denominations, because I know Catholics, I know a lot of Catholics have expressed this sentiment as well, that sort of Catholic guilt. When you did grow up in it, or when you came to it at a very vulnerable place in your life, your neural pathways are literally wired to believe that you are wrong and that the institution is right. And that the person at the head of the institution is right, especially because they are the ones that have been touted to have all of the divine connection. And it's really hard. Sometimes I can be as awake to this idea as I want to, and I've talked about it as much as possible, but I still will relapse to that base instinct, especially if my defenses are low or I'm not feeling or well or something.
You know, and I think what you said there was gold. And I know you're going to talk about the systematic kind of idea. But that's the way the church has survived, is by programming children to grow up and think that. I mean, the thing that really woke me up was my daughter came out as bi.
Okay.
When she was 12 in her Sunday school small group.
Okay.
Right. And so I had, like, as a 2,500 member church, so I had everybody walking up to me going, "We heard about your daughter. We're so sorry. Basically, we're going to try to fix her. We're here for you, whatever have you." And then throughout the rest of the time, I had the leadership of the church saying, kind of gaslighting me for being a bad parent. And I'm like, okay, I got to tell you, if it's between my daughter and the church is going to lose every single time.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
But they will take anything, and because they are the superior ones,
yeah,
totally twist and gaslight you.
Yeah.
So they can maintain that power and hold that power over you as an individual.
Yep. And then
that's
yeah, and that's also like, that's a thing, is that they will hold that power over you, and they will purport to hold that power over communities, and they will make you feel cut off. They will make you feel weird. They will make you feel like the loud minority, and the silent majority is behind them, and you're just speaking up, and you're just a faction and all of that. But really, they're just using that tactic to manipulate you to maintain power and control.
Yeah, and they're so good at it.
Yes. Yes.
Terrible how good they are at
it. It is, yeah. Oh my goodness. Michael, you are so correct. Doctrine of original sin. I want to do a whole episode on this. That is an absolute tool that people use to maintain power and control, is because, like, they've defeated their sin nature, or at least they're further along, and you're just an infallible person. Literally, the doctrine of a rich problem with it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that is incredibly accurate, because you can't argue against it, because they are founded in the Word of God.
Exactly.
Okay, and don't you understand? They hide behind those theological principles, so-called, in the Word of God.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
I have a professor, author, friend. I don't know. I had her on Conversations before she was my professor, but I also really, really nerd out of her. On her work. Her name is Dr. Rachel Mikva, and she is my professor at Chicago Theological Seminary. She's also she has her PhD. I'm not positive what it's in, but she's also a rabbi. So has completed a high level of education. And one of the books that she's written it's called Dangerous Religious Ideas. Her thesis statement is that every religious idea is a dangerous idea. And that is why the Abrahamic faiths in particular have self-critical roots built into them. But
Wow.
what I would see, I think that statement is absolutely accurate, and I'm adding on to this. This is not part of her thesis. This is me, but I believe that what has happened is that we've taken the self-critical roots out of it. It is not there, and it is now developed into a theology of them and us. And when you are the them, you are always the outlier, and they will always gaslight you because you're not in us. And I think that what happens in churches with religious leaders and religious communities is that they have recognized that all ideas are dangerous religious ideas, and they are comfortable wielding them against people.
Yeah. The problem they're experiencing is the fact that since the internet was created,
Oh.
people have a voice and have resources they never had before.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church is struggling because of the challenge of people and
Yes.
critical thinking.
Yep.
And no longer are you going to a church and just thinking, okay, this is what everybody in the world believes,
Mhm.
or this is right. But then you go on the internet and you go, oh, well, what about this? And what about that?
Yes.
And their shit is exposed.
Yep, exactly. And that abuse can't continue in the light because it becomes exposed. And I think it's absolutely important that it is absolutely important that we continue to expose and speak up, because there are thousands of people that are subject to gaslighting from a religious figure and from a religious system on the regular, and so many people are stuck feeling like it is them, and it's not you. I mean, humans are fallible. I believe humans are fallible, but I do not believe that humans are innately evil. I think there's some really bad oddballs that throw some really big monkey wrenches into the cogs, but I do not think that humanity on a whole is evil, and I do not think that the world on a whole is bad. And I think that the notion that humanity is evil and that the world is bad is a tool of an abusive system. And now we the people are left to deal with the ramifications of hearing those messages over and over and over again.
Totally what you just said before. It's about power and it's about keeping people in control.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing that Augustine did.
Yes.
I mean, it's all about the power. I mean, you had three other theological study type schools at the time of Augustine, and one that, and the fourth one believed in hell. The
Yep.
other three believed, hey, we're all going to heaven.
Yep.
But
Yep.
who got a hold of it and who empowered it and how did they use that? Boom.
Yes.
There it is.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. I'm totally rifling back through my history of Christian thought class last semester, which I loved. But you're so right that he Michael said, cue the music, I've got the power. You are correct. That was a very Augustinian thing right there. And
Yeah.
it's really important that people know that that wasn't the majority even. It wasn't even close. It wasn't even half and half. It was like 1/4. But I think what abusers have realized, and I'm applying the psychological matrix of abusive behavior to a historical person and a theological figure. I'm just putting that right out there, but that's kind of how I tend to view things. So shoot me. You know what I mean? But I think that the abusers in general have always realized that like confusion and fear are the best way to operate. So if I, as a leader or as a system, can strike fear in someone, I can either unite them or control them, or both, right? Because it's not always the same. You know what I mean? Sometimes people use fear to unite a group to be against another group. Sometimes people use fear to control the group that they're a part of. So drawing that delineation.
Yes.
But that is that theological move from Augustine, and then that resulting behavior that we see played out, especially in American churches, very hyperbolically, is that fear tactic, right? People literally will value the fear of God more than the love of God. And I have had so many Muslim friends and Jewish friends in the past year and a half ask me, why do you guys talk about the fear of God so much? Because it's an incredibly effective tool for manipulation.
Oh yeah. I mean, let's put it this way. We're taught as children the story of the flood.
Yep.
Okay, last time I checked in scripture, God killed more people than Satan. I mean,
Thank you. Yes.
Mass genocide,
Yep.
right? I mean, or he gambled with Job's life,
Yep.
supposedly, right? I
Yep.
mean, it's a wager, and everything's supposed to be better because he blessed him with more cattle and everything at the end. But literally, he wagered
Yes.
other people's lives.
Yeah.
A bet.
Yep.
You know?
Abraham and Isaac. I mean, in the story of
Yeah.
Abraham and Isaac, you know what's really interesting? If you look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all spring from the story of Abraham, but they all have different retellings of the account of Abraham. And one of the interesting parts is that not all of them agree about the agency of Isaac, right? Did Isaac know that Isaac was the sacrifice? Was Isaac completely unaware? Was Isaac willing? Or was Isaac aware and unwilling? Like, all of the texts read differently. But either way you see it, it's like divine child abuse. It's like God's drunk and high up there, and it's like, let's see what happens.
It's totally.
Yeah.
All throughout Scripture, you see gaslighting and abuse and all kinds of things. And this is, there's a reason why people fear God.
Exactly. And that's the important part, is it's not untethered from the Bible. People ask me all the time why I am still a Christian. I actually get a lot of heat from it. I actually think Christian non-binary in all of these ways. But I say that I'm reluctantly Christian because I'm like, listen, someone's got to try and figure out how this shit can be righted. You know what I mean? But this fear and this abuse is not at all untethered from contemporary theology and contemporary methods of preaching and contemporary modes of operation, particularly in churches that aren't tied to overarching denominations and bodies. Now, I'm the last person to be an apologist for the institution, but there is something to be said to having someone that tells you you're not the God in your own realm. And I think that's how a lot of abusers get off, right? Be them leaders of religious organizations, or be them people in familial situations, is that they cloister and they hide and they establish their own supremacy, and at every turn they reinforce that supremacy.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it even flows into the Scripture in the way that, God is one to be feared.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so you're talking about the supreme being, the He, right? The He, and you're talking about the supreme being, and He's such a different contrast than Jesus. But one of the great rodeos that's been done is the fact that somehow Jesus is also roped into God, and God is Jesus, so it makes God look more friendly. Right?
It's a campaign.
Whereas, it is. It's a total campaign. It's like a president and vice president, going out there or something,
Yes, I love that. No, it's totally true. And it's this campaign to make it palatable or at least acceptable. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. It eases things because, if you're always feared of this God, just like, hey, you do that, God's going to strike you down with a lightning bolt. Well, nowhere in Scripture is that ever said, right? First of all.
Yeah.
All right. But that's the fear that's in there. So instead of having all that fear, Jesus is your man. Jesus is the one that loves everybody. He's going to hold you. He's going to take care of you. He's going to stand in the courtroom and say you're okay.
Yep.
Yeah, It's like these mental gymnastics that take place.
It is. I was actually reading recently about like nonviolent atonement theories, which were really interesting, and I need to study much more on the matter. But it was really interesting to me to think about ways, because I'm kind of on this process, like I'm a Christian. And I actually recently was approved for ordination, for the process of ordination. I'm not ordained yet, but I'm approved to be in the process, right? Which is fantastic, through a Christian church. But I'll be real honest with you. I am always trying to find some sort of way that makes this all make sense sometimes.
Yeah.
And I see, I see a lot of things very, very not the same way that I grew up to see them. But I'm always still in process of figuring this out, because in so many ways, Jesus is your man, and God's this angry dude, and they're trying to temper each other, and you've got that going on, but somehow this is also hyperbolic. Like, how does this function? How do we live? How does this work? And how does it work in a way that doesn't set people up to be the victim? Because honestly, the craziest thing I've seen in the past year is a bunch of straight white cis male Christians saying that they're being oppressed and using the scripture to support that. Like, how there's got to be a way that this doesn't end like that, because that is horseshit. That is a spin game. You know what I mean? How how do you think on an individual level people can kind of cope with that theology and figure out, you know, if they want to be involved in faith still? Because deconstruction isn't an end point, it's a process, and some people don't ever believe again, and some people's faith is reinstored, and some people get scared and they regress. But what is your advice to people who are kind of trying to deal with the effects of this system and kind of figure out what they want to do now?
You know, it's a great question, and I'll say this: when I do life coaching with someone, I never have an end goal in mind for them in the way of any kind of belief system. I think it's important that when someone's deconstructing, they can't take it all on at once. Because literally, if you deconstruct, you start to realize that everything the church or an organized religion or anything has taught you has literally gone into every aspect of you.
Yes.
Right. So you look at marriage different. You look at lying. You look at all these black and white things supposedly, and suddenly, when people are deconstructing, I look at them and go, okay, let's start from the ground up, and let's do one thing at a time.
Yes.
We're not going to tackle the whole elephant.
Yep.
Right. I mean, this is going to take a little bit at a time to do that. And so my advice to them and the process I take them through is number one, locating their trauma and their challenge. And we slowly start to deconstruct those things, and I allow them to, lack of better words, rebuild or grow in their spirituality from there. Because you're right, I've counseled lots of people, and it's a matter of some stay in the church, some switch denominations. Some go out and become agnostic and believe in a higher power, but maybe not necessarily just the God of the Bible. And some become atheists, for some reason, and they all have their reasons, but they have to do it one part of a time, or else they're going to be angry at everything and feel like their life is crashing down around them.
It's so true, because it is, you're so right, it's so holistic, especially, like, I'll speak from my experience, because that's the only one I can speak from with authority, right? But I mean, for me, I not only grew up in the church, I double fisted the Kool-Aid. Like, I didn't just drink it, I double fisted it, because not only did I believe it, I believed it enough to actively and passionately perpetuate it, which is something that I honestly have to forgive myself for, because I didn't know better. And now that I know better, I do better. But that's just a little insight into my psyche. But I think it's very important that you realize this is a lot, and there's a lot of, like we said earlier, systemic ramifications to it. There's political ramifications to it. There's social ramifications to it, because America literally has no idea about the historical church, but man, we will be really loud and rail on about it, like fundamentalism. My own private beef there. But there is so much to this realization that you're being gaslit, especially from a spiritual leader.
And I think there needs to be that, and just like you said, to piggyback off that, I think there needs to be that forgiveness of one. You have to learn to forgive yourself. As a pastor 20 plus years and drinking both fisting both Kool-Aid, like you said, there has to look back and go, wow, okay, I was wrong, at least in my mind, for me. And I've got to learn to be okay with that.
I have to.
And when you're gaslit, you have to forgive yourself for allowing yourself to be gaslit.
Absolutely.
And go, okay. And then you start to find your voice.
Yep.
Once that forgiveness takes place. But it takes that forgiveness to take place.
It does. And it's such an integral part, because you have to, I think this is kind of one of the hardest parts, is that an admission of vulnerability, perhaps. Like, it feels embarrassing to have experienced this, right? It feels yucky, right?
Yeah.
It does, but you have to realize that, like, you are now responsible from healing from this, but you didn't cause it, you didn't do it, and you don't have to be subject to it anymore, right?
Yeah. And so when I say forgiveness, I mean forgiving yourself. I'm not saying
Yeah.
you have to forgive the other person.
So important,
I
because
just want to
that,
make that point.
I feel like that's like an end of the road conversation, right?
That's a whole nother arena.
Right.
Right. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. And that like the process of deconstruction is something that is so highly individualized. And I know deconstruction is a buzzword, and I know gaslighting is a buzzword, and people really want to slam people for being woke right now, as if being intellectual is like, oh, that's bad. It's almost like being intellectual makes you more open minded. I don't know.
Well, and that's what the church doesn't want.
They do not want that.
I mean, they don't want an open-minded, especially somebody that even believes in any kind of science.
Yeah. No.
As
Science.
well.
Never heard her.
Bad.
Science never met her. No, they really don't want that, because then when you start to embrace your own agency, that is one step away from the abusive person and the abusive system. If you realize your own agency, you have found the key that will let you out of that situation, right? And like I said before, there is nothing funnier than watching someone whose power and abusive hold has just been broken, because you will see all sorts of uncharacteristic reactions. You'll see pastors screaming at people. You will see them behaving in absolutely unpastoral ways, and it's because they don't have a hold in that situation. And ironically, a lot of them will try and gaslight and be like, it wasn't that bad. I've had this happen to me, right? Pastors screaming at you, and then they're like, oh, it wasn't that bad, and you're just making things up, and you started it, and all these things literally coming out word for word. Like that, to me, I think is really, it's both the key and the indicator that you have found. It's the key to the door and the indicator that you have found the door, right?
Yes, totally. Yeah, that's a great point. And I love the way you.
I think it's good, because I need sometimes I need those external validations, because I'm a super anxious person, like highly medicated for anxiety, and thank God for medical and recreational weed.
And medication's awesome.
It's fantastic. It keeps me so much more on a level field. But I look for those external signs that I'm doing something right. And sometimes those signs look like negatives to the world. But if I see this person who I know is being abusive, being completely furious and angry with me, I know I've done something right. Now, if that's someone that is angry at me is someone that I love, and someone that I know is wise and even tempered, or at least has my best interest in heart, that is an example of one outcome giving two very different viewpoints, right? But I've learned that I can trust myself, and that I can think critically, and that I can engage with this in a way that I can trust myself. And I think that's been one of the best parts for me of healing, right?
Well, and that's exactly right. You asked about the whole life coaching aspect.
Yeah.
It's to get somebody to that point. At least,
Yep.
to where they learn to trust themselves, because they've been robbed of that.
Uh-huh.
They've been gaslit so many times, or have been manipulated in their thinking, that they have trouble trusting who they are, or their own thoughts. And so it's getting them back to that point where they can trust themselves.
Yep. Yeah, and it's such a characteristic move of a gaslighter and of an abuser in any context, to be like, well, you did it. It's your fault. You're the reason everything's wrong, even though they're standing there holding all of the pieces, right?
Yes.
I just think it's such a characteristic move. It's almost like a guarantee you're being gaslit when you have a realization and you start to feel like you're finding some clarity, and then someone's like, you caused this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I have another idea I want to run by you, and it's not necessarily interpersonal, but it's a part and parcel of this conversation, and so I'm very curious to hear what your response would be. Out of curiosity, what kind of church were you a pastor of, and what sort of was your background?
Okay, my original background was Southern Baptist.
Oh, okay.
I know, right?
Wow. Okay.
Yes. I mean, and I even went and got my master's from the Southern Baptist Seminary.
Uh-huh.
I was born and raised into that. After seminary, I realized I wasn't a very good Baptist. And so what do you do when you're a good Baptist? You start a non-denominational church.
Yep.
That's what you do, right? But your theology is still very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
You may differ on a little bit of things, so that disqualifies you from getting Southern Baptist money.
Yep.
But you still have that, and so my background is obviously very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of, purity culture before it was purity culture.
Dope.
You
Me
know,
too. Awesome. That
yeah,
didn't do any harm to anybody.
right. And if you wait for sex until marriage, if you don't, you're a used up piece of gum, or
Yep.
you're just, everybody you sleep with is going to be then you're going to take into the
Soul
bed with somebody.
ties. Ugh.
Yeah, all that kind of shit,
Okay,
right?
cool.
So,
Cool.
yeah,
Good.
yeah,
So
that's
you're going to
me.
understand this phrase that I'm coming at you with because it's going to be perfectly situated within your context,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
The idea is that, and I hear this verse used to gaslight people all the time. The amount of times that this verse has been used as a tool of gaslighting against me is like, the Lindsay Lohan gif from Mean Girls where it says the limit doesn't exist. That's this verse. So the verse is always, and I can't remember the reference, right? But the verse is always right that if there's confusion, Satan is the author of confusion. God does not. God, if
Yeah.
there is confusion in a situation, that is of the devil, and God is not present. So people have used that against me because they say, like, when you're queer or when you're coming out, right? If you're confused about your orientation, that must be of the devil. Or more recently, if there's confusion about a situation, right, that's happening, then the devil is present. Or if this religious person or religious group has a view of things, right, and you publish something that is counter to that and that exposes their toxicity, they'll say that the confusion proves that you are of the devil. Have you heard that verse used against you before, or in general?
Yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, it is a fallback.
Uh-huh.
It is the end all be all.
Uh-huh.
And so if you're bringing that confusion, if you are living that confusion, if you're questioning things and calling confusion, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Isn't
it's bad.
now I just had to bring this up, and this maybe I should shut the camera off because this is just me venting right now. But it is so absurd to me for people to use that kind of logic, particularly to gaslight others, because they're like, there's confusion in the situation. Never mind that I caused it, or that you know what I mean. Like, never mind that this could be, at best, an equal merit kind of situation. At worst, I caused all of this. But they'll say the
Right.
confusion means it's of the devil. Like, is that not classic gaslighting? Why way of a
It
Bible
it is
verse?
it is classic gaslighting, and the devil's always the scapegoat,
Uh huh.
right? Um, and so when you yank out God or the devil or something like that, you immediately gain the upper hand.
Mm-hmm.
It's like people that say God told me. Well,
Mm-hmm.
how are you going to argue with them about that,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like that's their own personal experience.
Yep.
And last time I checked, and I know you know this, but the last time I checked anything about Satan, God's the one that caused confusion on the tower of, when they're building the tower, right?
Yep.
Okay. So, and at the same time, Satan's all about orgies and heavy rock and roll. I mean, I don't
Yep.
think, I mean, it's, the confusion seems to be the way humanity understands God,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the way they view him.
Yeah, and I don't think that confusion is necessarily problematic because I remember seeing a video. I'm going to say it had to be around 2010 when this came out. It might not be the right date, but Rob Bell, who is like one of the OG heretics, right? If you like him, whoa, watch out. You are already
That's right.
blacklisted,
Right.
which
Yeah.
makes me want to read him more. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But before he released a book by this name last year, but there was a series of like speeches that he gave, and around 2010 called it was like everything is spiritual, and then the next one was the gods aren't angry, if I remember correctly. And hearing that phrase, I think the gods aren't angry really really changed my perspective because it was like all of a sudden it gave voice to what was kind of burgeoning within me, which was like it's okay to ask questions. Like, if there is a divine being who is overarching this whole shit show that is happening right now, certainly that divine being is okay with me questioning them. Because questions lead to answers, or at least to dialogue, right? And I
Right.
think that there's this idea of confusion being from the devil has actually been wielded in yet another way to turn people away from their own experience of the world.
Right. Well, I mean, and I'll take that just a little bit a step further
Yeah.
and say that I think that the Bible is used to continue that in the sense that, okay, God's not a God of confusion, supposedly.
Right,
Right?
supposedly.
Supposedly. And we're supposed to be able to ask God anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? And talk to him. Yet at the same time, you see the book of Job. And Job at the end is saying, what was this all about? And God harps on him, like, where were you when I created the foundations? And where
Yeah.
were you? And never gives him an answer.
Yeah, that's a real dick move now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. But it's like, okay, does he want questions or does he not want questions?
Yep.
When it comes down to it. And so I think that that verse that is thrown in your face is used for a catch-all.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever they think it's appropriate or when they need it.
Exactly.
Because in scripture, there are lots of times God's just like, I don't need to tell you.
Exactly.
Just do it.
Exactly. And like, if you believe in the resurrection narrative, which is an if, and I'm gonna just embrace my heretical flag, but I mean, the earliest recorded gospel doesn't have a resurrection narrative. And if you really do some study, the idea that Jesus would have been even placed in a tomb to be pulled out of is really anachronistic, like meaning it doesn't make much sense historically. I've been diving deep into Bart Ehrman for some research for school. So
Same here.
It's good stuff. But
and
like,
even the first one that you mentioned ends with the women going and not saying anything.
Exactly. Yep. There's this
right?
there's so much confusion surrounding the resurrection. But we're still okay with that story being the crux of what differentiates Christianity from Judaism. But it's confusion.
Not necessarily other religions.
Yeah.
Because I was taught that Christianity was separated from other religions because we believed in a risen Savior.
Same.
Right? But then you look at other religions and they have resurrected saviors.
Yes, I just want to yell, but I don't want to peek out my microphone. But yes, that's exactly it. Like, resurrection narratives were not at all unique in the time period. I mean, if you go back and look at different sources, like from the Greek and Roman eras, like resurrection narratives happened all the time. And so we're claiming superiority. We haven't firmly established really anything historically. Like, most scholars can safely say that, like, Jesus was a person. But there's still some people that don't that think that history doesn't even support that, and honestly, their arguments aren't terribly unfounded. But all of a sudden, right, we're just supposed to have this absolute certainty in this book that was written. At best, the earliest gospel was 40 years after Jesus' passing, and it was by someone who wasn't a contemporary, right? But if I'm confused, it's Satan.
Right.
Like, let's check the tapes here.
I know, right? And the amount that Paul actually wrote about Jesus, you could probably put on a note card.
Literally.
I mean, that's it.
Yep. Yeah, for those of you who aren't like necessarily biblical scholars, most of the New Testament is written by Paul, and most of what Paul says is not about Jesus. Furthermore, most of what Paul says was at least partially, if not directly, in contrast with other different groups of Christians at the time period. But we've just been fed this one narrative. So, just so we're aware here.
Nice job, Christine.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just really, really interesting to me that, like, the confusion, if it comes from someone who's a heretic, is Satan. But if it's in the Bible, we'll either theologically do away with it by writing different things into the text, or we have all these theological treaties that we've built around to shore up this area that is confusing and frankly weak.
So basically the same thing Jesus accused Judaism of doing with the Ten Commandments, in a sense, or the commandments.
Yep, exactly. And it's just like, I've learned so much from engaging with and having proximity to Judaism that I always say I'm like 10 seconds away from a conversion experience, because there's so much beauty and richness in there. And I mean, when you get down to it, a lot of the New Testament is frankly like anti-Semitic, at least in the ways it's being taught. And in this era of, I really think this is part of what builds this Christian nationalism, Christian superiority into the world that we see today. I mean, it's stitched into the fabric from the beginning. So I think it's really important for people who've been consumers of Christianity to at least encounter the fact that you may have been gaslit, and you do have the freedom to explore what that might mean for you.
Exactly. I think that's, I mean, I would imagine that if anybody that has been in any church for any kind of time has one time or another either been taught from the pulpit or just interactions with people have been gaslit one way or another.
Absolutely. What do you think, if you think this is valuable, but what do you think the value might be in people sort of publicly calling out gaslighting? Because I know I'm not a huge cancel culture fan, because I do think certain things need to be canceled, like Nazis. Like, I think we can all agree on that. Not sure why that's a resurgence. But in general, I think that there's a lot more gray area in the world, and that if we just immediately cancel everybody, there's no room for evolution. But what do you think the value might be in publicly exposing religious gaslighting, especially with people who have a track record of it?
I think it can be beneficial, especially for people that have suffered some form of abuse. I think that needs to be called out in church. I think the church needs to be held responsible, or religions, period, that do that need to be held responsible.
Absolutely.
That's not an issue that should be silent.
Yes.
Period. Anytime it also infringes upon our, our freedoms or our rights or anything like that, the view on marriage, everything, it needs to be called out.
Yeah.
And I think that, just like the Southern Baptist Convention,
Yes.
And the way they've handled abuse and everything else, and it needed to be called out, and it still needs to be called out.
Yeah. And there are people who still fundamentally align themselves with Christianity that still have called out this gaslighting perspective. Like when I say that people should feel free to, and perhaps encouraged to, just publicly call out gaslighting, you don't have to do that in a way that separates you from the church. The end of your journey, or your journey itself, is yours. But I do think that there is a validity. I just wrote in the chat box that I think that the church needs a little bit of a Me Too moment in this regards. Obviously, the sexual abuse, like scandals in the church, in all types of churches, not pointing any fingers.
Sure.
This is an issue that's well discussed, and I think becoming more discussed. It's taken a while, but I think the church needs to have a Me Too movement in admitting to, or even if the church won't admit to it, individuals need to have a moment where they just sort of call out this sort of, I guess what I would say, like what I view to be like a rampant trend of theologically sustained gaslighting. I don't know how else to couch that.
I would totally agree with you. The struggle with that, obviously, is it would have to be a pretty big movement, because they're so good at hiding their tracks.
Yes.
And so good at making, obviously, gaslighting other people to bring it up.
Yep.
It's the same thing as like Catholicism and, altar boys and all that situation. And the rape that occurs, the molestation. It took a significant number for them to finally acknowledge, okay, this probably happened, but they still, what did they do?
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah. And maybe, maybe that's where each person has to decide what engagement or level of connection they want to have to the church afterwards. But I think that the church is a worldwide institution, and this is part of what keeps me working in this field, is the church isn't going away. And the impact of religion is not going away, because it's a fundamental part of human sociological and psychological needs to belong. So the church isn't going away. But even if the church doesn't go away, it's still valid to stand up and say, like, yeah, I've been gaslit. And even for people outside of the church, because there are a whole hell of a lot of people who've never set foot in a church and they're still gaslit. I mean, we have gaslighting happen from the White House. We have gaslighting happening from the pulpits. We have gaslighting happening from the media. Like, this is a thing that's happening. And anyone who says it doesn't is someone who's benefiting from the gaslighting. And I think that there's a validity and just You know how the movement around like Black Lives Matter really caught on with the phrase "say their names." I think there is a validity in naming things, right? We see it in different religions. You get a name, or you have a name change or a shift when you convert or progress, or different things like that. I think there's value in naming things, and I think there is value in naming religious abuse when it happens, whether you are inside or outside of the church.
No, when you name it, it creates, obviously, for the lack of better words, more validity.
Yes.
Because the big struggle is it becomes a he said, she said.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and obviously the religious organizations that go, well, show me the proof that this person said that.
Mm-hmm. And even when there's video proof, they'll still deny it. They'll say,
Yes.
I might have behaved like a little bit poorly, but this person was inciting
Yes.
violence. I might have done a little bit, but this person is evil. I mean, I've literally had probably 50 videos made with that accusation lobbed at me. I mean, I'm like collecting it at this point. You know what I mean? But this is just, it still matters to say that, right? Because
Yes.
the more you expose it, the more it's out there, and it might not gain widespread traction, but someone's going to see that, and their experience is going to make more sense to them, right?
I agree.
I mean, that's what I would tend to say. So, yeah.
Nope, I am 100% behind you on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. We did have a comment here about there's a podcast called the Preacher Boys Podcast, which has done a lot of great work around abuse in religious settings. So I wanted to throw that out for anybody who might have seen that. And also that hashtag Church Too might already be a trending hashtag. So we're going to check on that and see, because if people want to use that, I think that'd be fantastic just to know. I think people underestimate the amount of importance in social media and stuff like that for building solidarity. But this is where we're at. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have 2 questions to wrap up for you. I actually would love to talk to you for like forever, but I have a couple more things to record tonight. So I have 2 questions. The last one is easy. The last one is our commercial for Brad. Or be rad, if you want to adopt the moniker. I'm just saying that's how you appear in my brain.
I'll adopt it.
But the question I would like to ask you, and you can answer it as briefly or as exponentially as you would like to, is if people they can't listen to the whole podcast and they just listen to the answer to this question, what would you want people to know about gaslighting, about spiritual gaslighting, about confronting it individually, confronting it systemically? This is your chance to say everything that you think that needs to be said that we might not have said already.
Well, I will try to keep it somewhat contained.
You were a pastor, so I don't know. Like I
know,
did
right?
a lot 20 minutes for the wrap up. So,
So, first thing I want to say is you're worth it.
Yeah.
Okay, you're worthy.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I want to say is good for you for recognizing it. You know, if you realize you've been gaslit, that is a really good first step. And then the third thing I'd say is not all people in the church are like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we have this idea that although the system I think is broken, there are still some really good people in the church that are kind, that are loving, accepting, that don't gaslight.
Yep.
Okay, so I always encourage people not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yep. Absolutely. And I don't say that. I also agree with that so much, and I don't say that to be an apologetic, because I hate the phrase, well, like, not all men. You know what I mean? Because that's really dismissive.
Yeah.
But I also urge people to hold the system and the people in 2 separate hands until they prove to you that they're intertwined.
Exactly. It's like they're not one and the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, you're right. Some people may seem like they're one and the same, or whatever have you, by the product of their upbringing or decisions. But there are people that are not a product of the system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've met some really good people that still have their faith,
Yeah.
have no desire or I guess you could say motive for power or manipulating people. I mean, case in point, you still have faith.
Right.
You would totally not fit within the churches I've been in.
Oh yeah,
right?
no, they're not a fan of me.
Right, exactly. But you're a good person. from what I can understand and know. And so, and that's my point.
Yeah.
I would never say, not all men, because I think that totally dismisses
Right.
that.
The system. Yep.
Exactly. It's just that everybody is different in a sense when it comes to gaslighting and how much they've been gaslit and their own experience.
Yeah.
And so I would just encourage people to be brave enough to speak up,
Yeah.
to find a therapist or a life coach or both, and heal.
Yeah.
Take that time and heal, find your inner confidence, find your critical thinking.
Yep.
And live your life in love.
Yeah. And reintroduce yourself to the value of your perspective on what that means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, when people ask me, it's like, hey, where do you stand in your spirituality? I go, well, the one thing I do know, number one, I don't want to be labeled again. After all my life being labeled, and I'm always growing. But the one thing I hold to the core is, hey, we should love others as ourselves.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
That's the one thing I've got to hold.
Absolutely. I think it's so crucial. And the reason that I ask or bring up the sort of the like paying attention to delineating the system from the person is because I get a lot of flack from atheists and Christians hate me equally because I won't do. Yeah, I'm really good at that stuff. So see me later on how to build that quotient up. But yeah, no, there's a lot of people come down hard on me because I didn't just disown my family when I came out, but I didn't want to disown my family. And does that mean that sometimes there's struggle and strife and confusion? Yes, but I don't think that's of the devil. I think that's a process of working out a relationship between fallible human beings. And for me, the love of my family and loving my family matters in a primary and central way to me because of who I am. It might not for everybody, and that's totally fair. But I think it's important that people really know you can have ire with the system, and you can carefully evaluate people because you do not have to let bad people into your life. But give people a chance to prove that they're bad, or at least revisit the topic once you're healed a little bit if it's someone that matters to you. Don't feel like you have to do anything because that is exactly the opposite of the freedom that we're talking about when you break free from gaslighting. You don't have to give up anything that you don't want to give up.
Yes. Yeah, and two of my best friends are still in the church, are Christian, but they're not the system.
Yeah,
to me, I mean, they're loving, they're understanding, they're caring.
Yep.
They accept my viewpoints. Unlike my family who, walked away.
Yep.
But I mean, that happens.
Yep.
You got to be true to yourself.
Yep. Absolutely. And that is valid, that true to yourselfness. I have a question here, which is a latecomer. It might be rhetorical, but I'm just going to read it because it just says a lot of important things. So, how can you say that you love someone wholeheartedly but refuse to listen to their concerns? How can you claim to be a Christian fundamentally but actively and publicly boo someone after they're speaking about systemic oppression of your community's children? How would you respond to that person? This theoretical person, right, that's doing these things.
Well, I mean, I ultimately, I mean, for me, and this is just me.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult, and maybe people view it as a cop out, but I've got to still love.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for me, if I didn't know their background or where they're coming from, or anything like that, I'm not going to judge them.
Right.
Okay. I know how I used to be. I know what I used to say.
Yeah.
And the impression that I caused.
Yep.
And so I'm going to love that person, but that doesn't mean that person has to be in my life.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. I have a fence, and only certain people are allowed in that fence.
Yep. And I think that's, you brought up an important fact too, because sometimes there is sort of a balance of what is most loving, right? Because sometimes calling something out and putting someone outside that fence and maybe exposing that is what's most loving, right? In this situation with this specific person, there is a bona fide track record of not changing. But in general, I think that you really, people need to realize that sometimes what is most loving is is just exposing poor behavior for what it is and walking away with no need for vindication. Like
No.
the behavior
And
will
that's
speak for itself, right?
and that is exactly accurate, because you can expose the behavior. You can expose what someone else has said or their action, what they've done, but you don't have to stick around for it.
That is what I was hoping you would come around to, because we're of the same mentality in this too, right? It's like not every fight is mine, and not every person is worth a follow up. Like there are very few people who criticize me that I even give a second thought to, because I've done a whole hell of a lot of work to be who I am and where I am. But I think there is a validity of like, this is sometimes what's most loving is exposing bad things and just walking away without a parting shot and letting that be exposed, you know?
And you have to be comfortable that you can't change them.
Yep.
Or
Absolutely.
it's not your responsibility to
Yep.
change them.
Yep.
And so, I mean, I have lots of things that I'll expose or talk about or point out and not hang around for it. And the
Yep.
only people that get to say into my life are inside my fence, the
Yes.
people I trust, because I know that they love me.
Yes. Yep.
You know? And if they love me, I'll listen to them.
Exactly.
But if they're just outside doing what they do, no
Yep.
thanks.
That for me is what separates, the decision about my family from the decision about like sort of the cheap seats that I experience in my life on a daily basis. Is
Sure.
that understanding knowledge that they love me and that intent. So I think that's really important. Well, thank you for fielding those questions. I would love to give you just a second here to let all of our folks know. I know these aren't your main two platforms, so maybe shout out, like who you are, your business name, what you do, how people can get in touch with you, that sort of a thing.
All right. My name is Brad. You can find me on IG, Instagram. I'm brad.lifecoach. You can find my website at coachingwithbrad.org. I specialize in religious trauma, healing in religious trauma, not religious trauma.
Not just
itself.
causing it.
It's really bad. All right. So I'm not. I don't cause you religious trauma.
Oh my God! This is why I love recording live.
I know, it's great. I say stupid stuff like that all the time.
Yep.
It's true.
Same.
Something to laugh at, right?
Yep.
So if you struggle with past gaslighting, religious trauma, if you're deconstructing on any level, if you're trying to find out more about what you believe and who you are, and trying to gain your voice back, if you're even trying to budget time in relationships or anything like that, I handle all of those aspects of
Awesome.
life. And so you can go on my website and you can have a free discovery call. It's a 45-minute call where you can grill me of questions, and I can talk to you and say, hey, do you want to work together or not?
Yeah.
And we can do that. So just
What-
don't be afraid to reach out.
What's your website URL again?
It is coachingwithbrad.org.
All right, perfect. I can't remember if you said it or not. I want to make sure it was out there. So, friends, thank you so much for joining. Brad, thank you so much for joining. This conversation was every bit as delightful as I thought it was going to be. It's fantastic, and I can't wait to work together in the future, surely. So, make sure, friends, part of the benefit of building community in the way that we do with conversations is that we get to give a voice and a platform to people who are doing amazing things in the world. And so to date, Conversations has paid 0 of our guests, which is astounding considering the caliber of people that we've had on these conversations. But please give Brad a like and a follow. Check out his website. All of these things matter a lot to those of us who are content creators and trying to forge new paths that people don't necessarily know how to pay us for. We're doing these sort of works in the margins, and it's really meaningful to the world to be able to do these things, and it's only by your support that things move forward. And even if you never donate a penny to my Patreon or even go to a session of Brad's, liking, sharing, and commenting are those things that are almost as important as money, because they boost the reach and they get the word out to those who really, really need to hear it. So please give Brad a like and a follow, and also check out Conversations. That would be great. Thank you so much, Brad, for coming. You are a delight. I'm going to set you free for this evening, but I appreciate you, and we'll talk to you
Thank
again
you.
soon.
See you later.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
Night.